Pues como gusto. Ya metiendo el desorden. Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todas y a todos por
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. We would like to thank the University of Guadalajara and the Cultural Department for organizing this event, the siege upon civilization wall to wall. So you all know what we entail with the from wall to wall in the name. So we're celebrating the anniversary of the Berlin Wall, and today we see the rebirth of these ideas to set walls and divide human populations. Well, without further ado, I would like to say thank you to our panelists for this afternoon. Julia Carabias, thank you very much for joining us. Jose Sarucan, thank you very much. And Fernando Tudela, thank you very much for joining us. Later on, I'll formally introduce each one of them. And of course, as the invitation calls for, we're going to talk about the protection of the environment vis-a-vis the anti-scientific rhetoric. And of course, this raises a lot of questions: what kind of civilizations we want to have, and for whom. We're going to talk about this rhetoric. What is its origin? What can be its impact, its effects on civilization? And of course, thousands and millions of human beings have been taken apart from this type of rhetoric. And for some, there are promises: hunger, the lack of health services, being homeless, being jobless. How can we make these pressing issues into a reality that we are addressing? And how can we make sure that we see the toll of the changes in the environment? We're here to talk about global climate that entails climate change, loss of ecosystems, the extinction of different species, the contamination of oceans, water, and land, population growth, poverty, concentration of wealth, war. Apparently, we have designed a perfect storm. How can we make it happen so that technological breakthroughs communicate better amongst each other, so we can have the possibility to make better decisions as politicians and as citizens in general? To talk about these issues, we have with us on the stage three individuals, three academicians that in public service, they have made major contributions to understand all of these issues. And in order to make this conversation more smooth, we have structured it the following way. In order to get started, we will hear from our guests. They're going to share with us their ideas, their opinions, and then we'll have a Q&A led by me, the moderator, and we will then hear from the audience. We will receive your questions. So please, if you have a question, you can look for floor staff and get a card. And then we will wrap up with some final remarks from our panelists. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelist. Jose Sarucan Kermes, a PhD in ecology from the University of Wales, has published more than 190 papers and scientific books. 100 casos de éxito, El Patrimonio General de México, also written in tandem with Julia Carabias, Climate Change and Its Solutions, co-authored by Dr. Molina and Julia Carabias. He teaches at UNAM since 1973. He is a researcher and also a director of the Biology Institute and coordinator of different scientific programs, and has been also the part of the highest ranking positions in UNAM, and has received different honoris causa PhDs from 10 universities in Mexico and abroad, and he is member of the Colegio Nacional since '87. And he has been awarded with different prizes, among which we have the appointment as honorary academic in 2014, the Merit Medal, and the Champions of the Earth Award by UN. He heads the National Commission for the Use of Biodiversity, CONABIO. Julia Carabias graduated from the Science School from UNAM and holds an honoris causa PhD from Nuevo León University. She's been awarded as a scientist with many different prizes. He has worked for the restoration and management of natural resources in Mexico, and she has published many books and papers. She was the head in 1994 of the National Ecology Institute and secretary of the Fisheries and the Environment Ministry, Semarnat. She's a researcher for the Science School and vice chair of the Interdisciplinary Center for the Environment, a civil association that studies the environment, and she also coordinates the program for the Lacandona Natural Resources Program. Fernando Tudela holds a PhD in architecture from Seville University, and along his life he has filled different positions and has been in different fields. For example, we can mention his professor position in different universities. He was an official for human settlements from the UN, a researcher from Colegio de Mexico, and Chief of Staff of the Environmental and Fisheries Ministry, Julia Carabias, when she was in office. Also an advisor to Semarnat, and many books and papers have come out from his pen in the same field, development and the environment. So without further ado, I would like to ask Julia to begin this conversation, but setting on this table the main issues to address. Please.
Thank you. These are difficult times, no doubt, as we've had other difficult times, and I'm sure there will be more. I think the important thing is to know how to prepare ourselves to face up to these challenges. That's why I truly celebrate this colloquium. I thank you for inviting me, because we are debating, as we have heard, in the auditoriums and with people following us online. And of course, these ideas are there for consultation, and many people are doing this. I believe this has been enormous success and a wonderful idea to hold this meeting. And I think one of the important elements for the appropriate decision-making process lies in having the best science possible. And this seems to be quite obvious. However, if there is no culture for the decision-making process based on science, then things get enormously complicated. I believe that accomplishing this nature objective, or this type of objective for decisions to be correctly informed, requires various steps that we have to build, we have to strengthen. First, we need to have quality science, no doubt about it. We should put this science at the reach of those that are making decisions. It is also necessary to create conditions so that decisions are made. To a certain degree, those that are not taking decisions have to understand the political cost of not doing so. And for these decisions to include the will to face up to this cost. Sometimes they're difficult decisions, of course. We also need to have the monitoring mechanisms, the mechanisms for the assessment, for the evaluation. We have to which and adjust those decision-making process, political decisions, for instance, and for us to be eventually be able to adjust the decisions we make. This process, which seems to be quite obvious, it is a process of the cycle for the design, the application of public policies, and their enforcement, of course. But it produces many resistances when anyone tries to implement it. I think those resistances are part of the culture of for us to be fitting this and for us to nurture and to root a scientific discourse in everything we do. Let me translate these ideas that I'm posing at the beginning of my presentation of how science is absolutely basic for us to make appropriate decisions and correct policies. Therefore, I would like to talk about environmental sciences and environmental policies. I wanted to mention 3 items. I know we don't have much time, so I will just mention them briefly. Later, we could go into greater detail. These resistances that I am referring to in the decision-making process are there because this is something that affects interests that are sometimes economic, sometimes political power group interests, and obviously we're all thinking about it since the beginning of this session, since the presentation was made by Mireya. That's Trump's anti-scientific discourse that denies the science of climate change, among many other denials and negations of science. I would not like to go into greater detail. Maybe my colleagues will do that. What I wanted to do was to set on the table for our analysis platform that this type of anti-scientific discourse is right at home in Mexico. And this is of great concern to me. I wanted to mention 2 examples to show you how this is expressed. One of the examples of how, when we're affecting vested interests, economic interests, there's a reaction with the anti-scientific discourse. Science has shown that in the case of fishing, the fish populations that are being used are declining very fast. There's an overexploitation. And this is happening because of different factors. Because we're granting more permits, there are pressures, there are diesel subsidies, more time is devoted, thanks to diesel subsidies, to sea fleets, and more fishing activities are being implemented, so there's a decline. And the same with the exploitation of aquifers, and the same with damage and the impact on high value, biological value of the mining impact. And when we show the impact, when we clearly explain those pressure factors that science is being able to clearly define, they're not taken into account to readdress, reorient our policies. What we have is an anti-scientific discourse in which we are hippies, ecologists, that we are opposing progress, that we want to go to the cave times, that we don't care about people but animals. And we start getting this flood of slander, defamation, and lies that permeate everything because their power groups, they have a lot of access to political spaces, and they have access to the media. And then, in the face of a medium of a lot of social backwardness and educational backwardness, of lack of information, these discourses take advantage of the situation of people's poverty, for instance, and they start winning places. We see deterioration taking place so fast, and there are no true changes in all this. Let me mention another one, which is also part of the answer to this economic interest, but this is also something, this anti-scientific discourse is also generated because of political interests. Many times, in a very lamentable fashion, we also have the participation of some scientists that are accommodating their knowledge to the so-called cause, and this means that the means justify the end. So this discourse that is being gestated in the countryside, in communities, in rural communities, means that research is indispensable to continue with biological knowledge for the inventories of our country. We do not know all the biodiversity we have. So those inventories are reduced and translated into biopiracy when we are working with communities in the foment and management of sustainable resources to improve their quality of life. Then people say that the backdrop of all this is the pillage of their own land. So, in the face of ignorance, poverty, and social inequalities, this education backwardness that I referred to, the lack and access to information, then that's how an anti-scientific discourse is created. It is installed and it is favoring power mafias that are profiting with poverty. And this is something we see every day in our country. Let me point out a second element of this anti-scientific discourse. There is no doubt that research in Mexico has been strengthened, it has been growing, it has had an incidence on many instruments and policies. In the case of environmental policies, ecological, territorial, and protected areas, and the ordering process, environmental policies, a lot of those are based on technical, scientific, very sound elements. We've seen an increase of institutions that are attending to environmental issues. In higher education, for instance, in the government, we have increasingly more programs, more careers, more special studies and certificates. We are training more people day by day in this field, but there's a lot of information that's not being translated into recommendations. So then we are wasting a pool of enormous knowledge that because we're not listening to scientists, and this runs the risk of simplifying the way in which those decisions are made. I would like to mention three situations of concern. There also a space in which the anti-scientific discourse can really move in. We don't have appropriate transfer mechanisms of this scientific knowledge so that we can tie it to decision makers. We don't have the necessary spaces as an interface. And I think that an exception of this is precisely CONAVIO. I believe that is the exceptional institution with the world prestigious position. It has shown how knowledge of biodiversity has an impact on public policies. And from my viewpoint, I think it should have greater impact. It would be more mandatory having to consult CONAVIO. But we don't have that for the other natural resources, not in water, although we should have it, because there's an institution that should be in charge of that. We don't have it in energy. We don't have it in soil use. We don't have it in air either. So there's lack of communicating vessels between science and the decision-making process. This is something we have to build. Second, if we're talking about quality science, we have to assess the science. In Mexico, we now have important assessment mechanisms of people doing science, scientists, SNI, and many other institutions in Mexico. With time, they've been alienating scientists from the decision-making process. Let me put it this way. When articles are the guarantee of a better form of life, we don't devote or dedicate the necessary time to reflect on the fact and how those findings, scientific findings, can be translated into recommendations and where it is that we can participate in those recommendations. I think this is something which still quite in effect for us to continue analyzing it, because what's been good to analyze the quality of science, well, this is something that we have to avoid it from becoming an obstacle for this transfer of knowledge towards the decision-making process. A third element. Science works with margins of uncertainty, and therefore those uncertainties can be seen in the phenomena we study, and we can therefore know that they're used by the anti-scientific discourse. The fact there's uncertainty does not mean there is no foundation so that a decision can be made with full awareness of the decision itself. And whenever those margins of uncertainty exist, but we can rest assured also that we have risks, then what should prevail would be the precautionary principle. This is something which is strongly rejected by many of the economic vested interest groups that are affected by those decisions. So we're not able to have the precautionary principle in our legal framework, in our everyday work on public policies. Those situations do not help us dismantle the anti-scientific discourse. The necessary science to face environmental challenges requires necessarily a comprehensive multidisciplinary vision. This is another one of the major obstacles to understand the complex social environmental systems. Science continues being produced in a fragmented fashion, and it is not that this is a critique on specialization. No way, but the isolation of the understanding of this subject of study that should be within a context of being understood through different visions. That's an effort that's growing. In our university, it is growing. However, it is still quite marginal. So this is not obviously translated in the everyday work of institutions or public policies that are still completely fragmented. That's my reflection on this anti-scientific discourse. I would like to conclude my intervention with a final reflection, which is more in the ground or the field, not so much of scientific elements, but mainly regarding ethics. We're clear, and science has shown that progress of humankind has been at very high cost for the functioning of the planet. The interference, the intervention in humankind, and this functioning, transgressing a lot of the physical elements and also the limits, the boundaries that allowed the environment to be stable, as well as the development of civilization, at least in the last 10,000 years. Everything has been altered. And as Wilson says, we are running the risk, and we're endangered, us and everything on this planet. The thing is, how are we consuming? How are we occupying the territory? This has to do with a development model. The current conviction of humankind on infinite growth, the revering of markets and obsession for consumption in which consumption signifies great satisfaction. Not being able to consume generates enormous anguish, anxiety, and a lot of social resentment. This is distancing ourselves from nature, especially urban citizens distancing from nature. We don't even know where water comes from, what foodstuffs come from, raw materials, fibers, everything we eat, the way we dress, everything we use for our daily activities. We do not know where that comes from. We are maximizing gains in the economy. The GDP is growing at the expense of that natural capital, and with that, we are facing at least two ethical problems. At one hand, we are limiting options of future generations, of those that cannot opine, those that are not voting yet. We are limiting their possibilities of well-being and development. This is an ethical issue. On the other hand, we're altering the living conditions, the life conditions of the rest of the living beings. We're just one more species among many other species on planet Earth, and perhaps we're even altering the course of evolution. There is no, in societies, a value of respect for nature and its intrinsic value. If this were a universal consensus, it is far from being it. Then we could establish, and we would have to establish different arrangements in society. And with respect for human rights, including rights of future generations, respect for nature, with the recognition and the intrinsic value, with the precautionary principle, everything would be a set of elements that would allow us to start building, construing a new culture to contribute towards a different world that would allow us to stop those sieges against civilization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Now let's hear from Dr. Sarukan. Thank you very much, Mireya. I would like to say thank you to UNAM and the University of Guadalajara. Thank you very much for this invitation to join you in this set of panels, this set of debates where we're going to touch upon very important ideas. Well, in general, for mankind, I believe that these debates are important, but also for Mexico. I am not going to get deeper into, how can I put it, this way of how science has been manipulated and the non-scientific discourse. Of course, there is no doubt. I've written about it. Of course, I'm going to touch about this issue, but superficially. Yes, of course, this is a serious problem, but we are facing an even more serious one. And the problems that are related to the environment, the problems that we're seeing globally, are situations that derive from human behavior. And if such human behavior can't understand what scientific developments have found in order to understand our environment, it's going to be very difficult to get anywhere. It's very unlikely, even how much non-scientific claims are out there, we won't be able to understand the state of the planet. And of course, I'm generalizing, of course, that this doesn't happen that much in the academic field. But some of the areas that I will discuss are there down at the root level. Of course, what I'm going to share is not disconnected from what Julia has mentioned. And of course, it is related to our own development, supranational economic interests that, of course, lead us to face a situation in our planet that has caused increasing problems. So, how big is the problem? Well, that is not in the mind of most people. And that's what I would like to talk about. And I hope that I'm going to stand up. I hope that I'm not infringing any protocol. Because for many years I've been a professor, so I like to walk around when I teach. And I can't see on top of that, so I would either have to get closer to this screen or this other one in order to make my presentation more agile. And for that to happen, I need this little thingy. Okay. There is a fundamental question. Of course, we are the product of anorganic evolution, but we're also part of a cultural evolution, and it's precisely based on nature. We come from nature. And this is something that apparently we have imported our cultural evolution from probably Walmart or from a company like Amazon, and we have assumed such a culture, and that is not the case. Our cultural evolution has emerged fundamentally from nature for more than 300,000, 250,000 years, and as a consequence, it is drenched. Of course, as Julia put it, we have seen our lives in isolation and we have forgotten about where we come from. Wilson said that every single human being inherently is with us. We are nature. We're part of nature. We are bound to nature. And I believe that this is a tragedy that we have disconnected ourselves from nature, and our culture actually is misunderstood. And our culture is not connected to how nature develops. And of course, this is the definition of culture. I'm not going to read it. You know how to read, so you can do it yourselves. But this is what human development has been able to define as the way to understand its more immediate and distant environment. For example, outer space and our solar system and our planet. At the same time that we have been molded by nature, we have reached a point that we have molded nature somehow for thousands of years. The influence of mankind in terms of inventing elements of nature, for example, domesticated plants and animals, it's a very clear example, and also the actual manipulation of ecosystems and the creation of ecosystems. This is a way where we have seen how mankind has influenced nature. And this is not part of our modern mindset, if we can call it somehow. So this type of manipulation, as we will see later on, has been immense in the last 250 years, 3 centuries. We've seen critical problems emerging in this time period. And if we add this to economic systems in which we are probably immersed, probably not Bhutan and some couple of countries, but we have produced a big gap between humans and nature, and that creates problems of great magnitude. And this type of modifications are very harmful when the changes are so harsh that create major modifications, and the way of living is altered, and also social changes happen, economic changes happen, and most of them happen suddenly. Well, also, as Carabias was saying, we have an the syndrome of withdrawal from nature. It's been well classified by sociologists, psychologists, and medical psychologists. There's withdrawal syndrome from nature. Generations after generations of kids, either they're born in cities or even when they haven't been in contact with nature, that creates changes in the psyche. And also behavioral changes do happen. Those are not perceptible, but we're going to see these changes developing significantly. And we have more and more generations, which there is isolation, where there is a complete disconnection between individuals. Many generations are disconnected from their environment, and nature is seen as dirty, as uncomfortable. Oh, I'm not going to use that path. We're creating cement flowers massively. And this is not the best highlight culturally in our species. Let me then move to the natural environment. This chart actually shows, this is it. Yes, it's working. And here we have the biologic diversity in our planet. Of course, we can trace back 500 million years. And we only see two trends. First, growth is one trend, and drops that we have seen over the course of this 500 million years. And it is very interesting to see the emergence of men. 250, 300 million years. Well, we've seen more species in this planet than ever before, and that's really interesting. And of course, it's interesting at the same time, and it is very important because, as you will see, the impact of what we're doing, of course, is not happening at a time where we see a drop in our biological diversity. No, we see peaks. Oh, how can I move it backwards? Is there a way to go back to my slides? Oh, or I'm just falling into a cliff. Yes, it's irreversible, like climate change. I don't know who did this for me, but thank you very much. So, we've seen different events. This sudden drops, the last one 65 million years ago when the dinosaurs disappeared. We have seen major extinctions. And these extinctions were natural. The one we're facing, well, this is one of the first impacts that we've seen. We see that this is caused by mankind. This sixth extinction that we're facing. And actually, we're taking the planet to extinction. This is one of the man-made activities that have happened in this very short time span. Well, such an impact is measurable. And please don't try to read each one of these graphs because it's impossible. I can't even do it myself. But what I'm showing here is a set of parameters. CO2 goes up in the atmosphere, we have greenhouse effect gases, we have species numbers going down, we see more erosion in the ground, we have forests depleted, and all of these are indicators of how we have made a tremendous impact to our environment. And I could have more and more of these charts. This is just figures, these are values, these are statistical figures that we have measured over time. I'm going to show this to you, and I'll do it very quickly. This is the amount of forests that we had 8,000 years ago. This is what we had. Well preserved, of course. You can see the gigantic dimensions of the loss. this is due to growing food, and that's not bad. I mean, we have to eat. This is a very important factor to consider, but have we done it right? What are the specific criteria that we should have taken into consideration, and what is the kind of knowledge that we should have used? And of course, the answer to that is we haven't done things right. And this has happened not only in Mexico. Here we have different forests that we had 200 years, 250, 300 years ago, and this is what we have today. The state of Veracruz, which has always been known as the green state. Well, it is green because there is grassland there. There's no forest anymore. It doesn't have any 3% of the forests it used to have. And of course, this is not taking us to a welfare situation for the dwellers of Veracruz that is not making them have high levels of schooling and a better standard of living. And of course, you've realized how cynical I am, because Veracruz is one of the poorest states, even with the type of richness it used to have way before. So mankind has taken ownership of the planet, but in an unprecedented way. Not a single species has captured that level of productivity. And this bar shows the biomass of all vertebrates 10,000 years ago. And you can't see it, but there is a black line that would equal the biomass represented by human beings 10,000 years ago. It represented 0.1% for all vertebrates. So this changed and started last century, where biomass and its domesticated animals, well, started showing half of the total figure. Now in 2015, well, we see absolute domination, where all the rest of vertebrate biomass equals to what mankind had 10,000 years ago. So this is a process where we see the absorption of primary productive activities. It's humongous. It's not due to obesity that we find in so many places in the world. All vertebrates that we domesticate, that we have with us in our households, represent this amount of biomass. We see a monopoly of life for one single species. One of the natural effects is that some species have disappeared, as Mireia mentioned right at the beginning. This is one of the most serious issues. Well, this species might have disappeared, and we've seen studies lately that these are top-notch studies that derived from very careful analysis. And actually what they're doing is they're showing the decline of species, that it's very visible, as you can see on the chart. During the 60s and the 70s, we see the collapse of a series of species, very specific ones that are becoming few in numbers. Their populations decrease because, due to deforestation, we take the land from where they get their food. Also extraction, like hunting trophies and meat for food. But here, every time the population sees a collapse, that takes them to the verge of extinction. And right now, we have very serious situations in front of us. So this is a very commonplace, probably the most commonplace in Mexico, in terms of the fauna and the flora of Los Tuxtlas. So these are the species that we used to have in Los Tuxtlas. So these are the ones that we don't have anymore. So that doesn't mean that these are extinct, but in this particular area, you can't see them. So this is the northern part of the Amazon rainforest in the Americas. So these are processes that have been measured. These are not estimates of what is happening. So what actually generates that our species affects the planet so much? Well, there are three things. Population. Our species is the only one that so far shows an exponential growth curve. Not a single species anywhere has been able to do this. Not even if you have bacteria in a petri dish and you let them grow. So you find levels of stabilization because there's no space, there are no nutrients. Something puts that growth to a halt. But our species has overcome obstacle after obstacle to reach a plateau with technology, with a series of developments. Some of them are good because that has meant that in life in average we see life expectancy. In Mexico, we had 40 years of life expectancy in 1940. Now it's 78. So that's good. I don't think that higher life expectancy is bad, but all of these elements combined produce a great populational growth that has serious effects. Well, I was curious to find, okay, we're 7 billion people in the world. So what do we stand for in terms of all human beings, all Homo sapiens that have existed in 250,000 years? We represent 7%. If we place every single human being living in this 250,000 years, we would be 7.4%. Well, of course, there are biological reasons that people age and die, but what I'm trying to say here is that it is only 7% of this species in a relatively short time, this 300,000 years, has produced an impact that it's even greater than the previous 300,000 years. So these are elements that must be understood, that must be placed into context to identify the magnitude of the effect of our species on the planet. And the second component that plays a very important role is consumption per capita, affluence, and how much are we consuming, each one of us, in terms of resources, in terms of energy, every single day. And so this is growing, and this is growing more than the population, and this is serious. More than populational growth, because this growth is even more exponential than we have seen when it comes to people in this planet. Here we have certain expectations. Per capita income, for example, in a forecast by the end of this century, we'll see an enormous increase in the planet. What I'm trying to say is that the trend to see more consumption is right there if we don't do things right in order to change. So it's not that we're trying to say, oh, this is going to change in 10 years. Well, if we fail to do something, it's going to follow this clear trend. And the third one of this causes of our human impact is, what is the kind of technology that we're using to fulfill our needs? Well, the most ancient technology, well, after using fire, has been agriculture. And this is a type of technology that was used up to, let's say, half the 18th century, early 19th century, without excessive impacts on the planet. Why? Because the this knowledge was linked to the environmental restrictions in the planet, and of course, it was limited to knowing the ecosystem, the land.
About this, or the eccentrics, but even more eccentric than Donald Trump. However, I believe that going back to what my fellow colleagues, my friends have said, what I'm concerned about is not the eccentric of all this. I'm worried about the centric part. An example, the Republican Party accepts without even blinking that President Trump can lift the Paris Accords. This is a key part of an international regime to approach climate change based on science. Remember the IPCC, it's from 1988. This is the convention that is part of the IPCC work. It was materialized in 1992 and the Paris Accords 2015. And without any consultation with anyone that has even a little bit of science in their accreditation, there hasn't been a single scientist that we could say he was summoned and said there was no problem with climate change. No, decisions are made with impressive impact on climate actions at the domestic and international levels, and nothing happens after that. For me, there's a continuum. We find the eccentrics that I referred to a few seconds ago, anti-scientific people, they are ignorant, and the ascientific ones that do things, make decisions, as if science didn't exist. So there's no valuation of explanatory orienting knowledge to explain things, but from the most eccentric ones to the absolutely ascientific ones, once they get sick, they go to the best hospital they can pay for. Well, the issue we're discussing today, I believe it goes through the recognition that the greatest obstacles for environmental and climate policies to move forward is not in the weakness or uncertainty of science. I mean, even in climate change, we have clear uncertainties. We don't understand well how the formation of clouds works that alter the equilibrium. We don't know that, etc. However, this is not the main obstacle, but in something that Dr. Sarukan mentioned, the structure of collective awareness. This is reflected in what Julia said on the lack of interest or the economic interest that overflows attention on scientific knowledge. But all that can be done without any impact on selections or choices, and this can be done without impact on choices because of the structure of collective awareness. I am not saying that it's not necessary to do more work on the part of the IPCC, that we really cannot really be working to shorten or to address the uncertainties. But everything we've said, those of us in this panel have said it, on the education deficit on these issues. This is an obvious deficit. We've done bad work in terms of the explanation of science, climate change, the environment. And science, like language, is a resource strengthened as we share it, as we socialize it. There are other resources that are worn out in detriment of Mireya. wearing them out or myself wearing them out, but science, language, and other cultural resources are strengthened as they are used. But we've lacked capacity, time, willingness, academic incentives, as Julia has mentioned, and we've had a lot of public disinterest to create this education and to really tackle this education deficit. However, this is not enough. Just talking about the situation is not enough. I remember what a colleague said when the climate change negotiations were taking place, someone from Brazil. He was saying, yes, you are right, but it's not enough. You are right, but not enough reason in everything you say. We see this every day. At the individual behavior level, do you think anyone has stopped smoking because someone explains that the lungs are suffering, that the lungs are not doing well with all that smoke of cigarettes and the epoch diseases and the cigarettes? Well, no. People say, yes, this is an inventory you're giving me. I will take it into account, but I will not quit smoking. So we know very well the evolution of public opinion of this collective awareness in some countries, among others in the United States. Yale University has a program since 2008, if I remember well. It is called Communication of Climate Change. And it differentiates six population packages: those that are alarmed by climate change, those that are preoccupied, those that are cautious about it, those that neglect it, and those that fully reject it. And the last report of this sort of X-ray of public opinion in the United States has been there just a few days ago. It was published November 16th. And 71% of U.S. citizens think that climate change is real. It is truly happening. And 54, this is a majority, understands this is anthropogenic, especially. And for the first time in many years, there's 22% of citizens that are quite preoccupied because of climate change in spite of government policies, etc. Of course, there's been ups and downs. For some reason, 2008, there was greater sensitization that is now being revisited in 2017. Those states, which are they? The inland or the deep America, they seem to be completely invulnerable to those ideas. But the most interesting part to me of all this is that sometime on one occasion, perhaps 2010, we tried to understand the scientific comprehension of those six strata of citizens. And they found that the best scientific knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to more awareness. 79% of people who reject climate change and 74% of those that are doubtful, they perfectly will understand that the greenhouse effect refers to greenhouse effect gases out in the atmosphere that are trapping infrared radiations. And this percentage is higher than that of those who are alarmed and preoccupied. 64%. And this leads to the last part of my reflection. The real problem of transformation of this collective awareness of this imaginary that Dr. Sarukan mentioned. How can we counteract this active communication, this anti-scientific communication, based on issues of the authority of the person expressing an opinion, for that expression to be any appearance of truth, of even if it's a half-truth, that will be nurturing interests of people receiving those expressions, for people to be interested in finding this proposal attractive, appealing. Someone who would say, well, you are paying a lot of taxes, well, that would be interesting. And a good dissemination apparatus, a loudspeaker without any questioning that persists on this message, something that is repetitious with a lot of corporate money behind it, to create networks for the politicization process, polarization process of public opinion. And this leads to a concept that I've always been so interested in, coined by Goldman of social sciences, the limits, the boundary of possible conscience, or calculable conscience or awareness, calculated conscience. This is the limit of what is inconceivable. In years of slavery, when slavery was the standard centuries ago, conceiving a slave, being a human being like oneself, was unimaginable. It was not part of the possibility of even thinking about it. And we go into an interesting topic of how to expand possible conscience or awareness to reach that state that Dr. Sarukan referred to. How do we see ourselves as what we really are, a piece of nature? And, well, I would say that climate change, the public debate, are not on science anymore. This is a debate on values, culture, visions of the world, ideologies. Scientific education plays a role in all this, but it is not sufficient, not enough. And if politics are the art of making that which is necessary possible, then what's possible comes from that which is imaginable. It would be very hard to make possible something that people will not imagine or understand and assimilate, and that has to do with knowledge, but also with emotions. There's an emotional intelligence which is faster and more immediate than the rational intelligence of science. We don't know how to live with the devastation we're all generating, as described but by many academics, by Dr. Sarukan, for instance. However, we do not know how to go about getting out of the situation, how to be able to build a low-carbon world, a resilient world, and the same we could say in terms of biodiversity, the two major global topics that for me they're not environmental topics, they have to do with development. How to work with the collective imaginary, the Anthropocene. Some talk about the Anthropocene xenia. Well, I would suggest go into Google, climate fiction. This was coined in 2007. It has to do with artistic work, literature, novels, stories, but it also has to do with scientific dissemination literature. I believe that this was also mentioned by Carabias. And current science is good to manufacture bricks, but it's really very bad to conceive buildings of complex functioning, to build narratives that change the collective imaginary, the perception we have of things. This sci-fi, the production of fiction narratives around environmental issues, approaches utopias, dystopias, which are the discussions of situations that are extreme apocalyptic, But we also find that within that ground, the disasters of not doing anything are quite photogenic, they're spectacular. But generally, the solutions usually seem prosaic and boring. What we need are stories that will lead us to take upon ourselves successful fights of shared values in a world which is stable, safe, secure, and that's a lot better than the world we live in now. So you will find a fascinating analysis of all that production which is related to science. And it's parallel to science, but it incorporates scientific because climate, environmental information that it doesn't have sound roots and profound scientific basis is not of much interest. We're simply talking about this hot imagination of writers. If that's what we're doing, we're not going anywhere, really, or at least not very far. I think that this topic, well, is not a matter of focusing on biodiversity. It's not a matter for common people. The answer would be bio what? Not even the climate. They understand the climate more. However, those aspects should be the backdrop of everyday plans and plots that will induce this expansion of collective awareness that it will come into us through osmosis, not only through a boring scientific discourse. That is my last idea would be this one, simply for us to take into account the power of fiction as a partner, an ally of science. Let me mention a recent expression of Salman Rushdie. He said that in today's country is so full of lies, fantasies, and fictions around truth itself that it could be necessary to have the intervention of fiction writers simply to explain, fully explain, what is reality, what is not reality. In effect, I believe that there we have a field of action which is not in itself a scientific academic field, but we have to approach this field because if we do not change those structures of knowledge and imagination, those boundaries, those limits of imagination at the collective level, collective imagination, then they will continue winning elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tudela. I am going to share a couple of questions. Well, I got the audience's ones. In the meantime, I will read yours, but based on what we have discussed here, what is the way so that information and all the scientific breakthroughs that we've heard from you in this presentation, how can we go beyond the limits of these spaces? Because every time these spaces are more reduced, we have smaller groups in this process of having more specialized areas of science where it's very hard to set a dialogue sometimes. How can we have a better impact? How can we extend our scope to reach a broader audience and actually affect what people decide to do in their everyday lives? What are the biggest barriers in order to change this link between knowledge, scientific information, and the public at large? Because, in my opinion, this is the only real way that we have to change this doomsday narrative that we have linked to climate change and global climate. In your opinion, how can we somehow change things in a different way?
I believe that in Mexico, we're lacking mechanisms we have to build. There's no doubt there are very successful experiences in which that knowledge is influencing the decision-making process, but to a certain degree, it is influencing the decision-making because of the quality and unit quality and a leader, which is CONAVE. Legally, this tie is not so clear. Asking scientists to be the translators, it's quite a complex thing because we have to continue doing science. And those spaces of translation, that's what I was referring to. This is something we have in terms of biodiversity. But it's quite lamentable that in water it doesn't work that way. And in other spaces, not even research is being done. This is completely abandoned. Food production, there's no research on this issue. And Professor Sarukan has mentioned it many times in the case. Those institutes, but they might or might not be taken into account. I think that we would have to have a space, a mandatory space. Then the president of Mexico and his cabinet would have to count on the instrument that links scientists with the decision making. In other countries, they have it. Science councils, that's what they're there for. That's their function. We have to build it. It's not just a matter of choosing or selecting a group of celebrities with their advice. It has to be a construction with everything in which work like natural capital, with the participation of Doctor, correct me, 750 researchers were participating, mainly from UNAM and other universities were there. In the National Biodiversity Strategy, more or less the same. And this is built with the trust and confidence that researchers are going to be finding an institution, being able to opine, to give their comments, observations, knowledge, information, and give of their time as well. That has a repercussion on something which is positive. But if it weren't for the credibility the institution has, they could not be taken into account and nothing would ever happen. No one would ever have a sanction for not paid attention to sciences. Those instruments, those mechanisms, those spaces in our country, this is something we have to build in Mexico. How far are we from building that? Very far away from everything we've said because this is not deep-rooted in our culture.
My understanding was how to outreach to people. Is that your question? And, well, before we used newspapers, magazines. I don't think that's the way. There are other electronic means to do that. It's a better way to have direct contact with people that out from their own decision look for information. They don't have a passive attitude, but so far we are not doing things right. And it is very clear to me that this responsibility, yes, of course, is the responsibility of researchers. Julia, who else is going to do it? Honestly, without any bias or without any political or ideological shenanigan. So I believe that we have a role to play, and that is to communicate these concepts, this knowledge more intensively. And it is not easy. It requires devotion, it requires research, so that is clear to me. but also at a different level. And this is the level where we should show a better impact. Now, governments should have programs to raise the awareness of people. People might say, oh no, that's not possible. Yes, it's doable. Remember this epidemics, the NH1. I remember with the Gordillo case, H1N1. Yes. Well, there was an enormous campaign. It was all over the place in radio and TV. You had it in posters. You had it everywhere. For something that was not that important, actually. Why they decided to do that, well, it doesn't matter. But what I'm trying to say is that it's doable. But for that, you need to be convinced of the severity of the problem. And for that to happen, we need visionaries, we need statesmen, we need leaders that we don't have in this world. Because there are no campaigns of that sort. And, well, not even I would expect a government campaign. We're not seeing that in the media, actually. I don't know how many programs are out there about the political discourse. On TV, you have plenty of shows where they discuss politics. How many? How many are out there? How many are out there to discuss these problems and the social consequences? There are no shows to talk about that. Why? Because the media live on sponsorships, and sponsors are business people. So business people produce items that we should buy, and no one is going to tell other people, don't buy more from what you need. That is nonsense. So that's what we have to deal with, and the only way to break with that is by individual actions, but particularly the decisions of the youth, specifically themselves. And that's what I try every time I give a talk. In high schools and colleges, I always try to tell them, I invite you to make a revolution of ideas, a revolution of knowledge, that such information is useful to change the country, to change ourselves, to change the future, your children and your grandchildren. But you address 100 people, 200 people in an auditorium, so you don't get that far. So we need to find a way to preach. I'm sorry for using this word, but we need to preach more efficiently. The right way is using the electronic media. And let's do it, and let's do it fast, because this is not an easy task. There's so many people scattered all over the place, and I'm very clear in terms of the fact that if we're going to do something, it has to come from, yes, the science community, because they're the ones who know how to do it, and also from the institutions where these communities are, and there are no institutions doing this yet. I believe that this is what universities must do, and this is not a passive activity, so institutions need to be very active, and I don't think this is happening. And finally, and ideally, it's in the hands of decision makers. They should be convinced first. But in spite of this enormous inertia to persuade them, because, well, it's of course, it goes beyond inertia, but there are many interests surrounding status quo. So they want more jobs, but that is linked to more consumption. So we are seeing here that we're seeing an increasing social inequality and also economic inequality. So something is not working here. And I believe that it's everybody's task. So if you're not convinced, you would say, hell with it. So why should I do this? Of course, you're not going to kill anyone. You're not going to steal from someone. But it's a, it's a complete disconnection from the environment we're living in.
I coincide with everything said. It's an enormous task. It's not only a matter of running the veil of ignorance. Would be good if it were only that. Fighting that ignorance, for instance, the little bees that are disappearing all over the planet don't tell people that they're going to not have enough honey. They're not going to have a lot of food because those little bees, aside from producing honey, they have another pollination process that allows us to access so many other foodstuffs. But there's part of ignorance, but there's also what Salman Rushdie was referring to. This world of open lies, fantasies, interests expressed in immediacy type of short term level. Medium term in Mexico would be July 2018. And I think we would have to fight from science. If we don't do it, no one else would do it. If we don't do it at the high schools, at the university levels, I would extend to what Dr. Sarukan just said. It starts with children at childhood. And the first obligation we have, it's really very difficult to get people enthused about it. Aside from everything, are wanting to know more. They're wanting to know more. They have to be enthusiastic. We have to enthuse those children because there is no other way of inducing this change. We have to choose our interlocutor, to think this interlocutor of the central part of the U.S., a 50-year-old white guy with economic problems, with an overall. How are we going to explain to him what this radiation effect of greenhouse effect gases so that he can change his behavior? I think this is a waste of our time. But if we really pick this enormous mass of youth, willing to be enthused about it, and through knowledge, which is not only useful and truthful, and it can be extraordinarily fun as well. That's what we need to do to move things. So a lot has been said about economic interests, and Julia spoke about this, and she is more than right, with the full intent of people not understanding sometimes, for people to be misinformed. But then on the other side, or disinformed as well. But there's another important economic thing that we would have to vindicate. This fight, for instance, by President Trump to revive the carbon economy. It's not that it's a scientific barbaric thing to do, but it's also an economic barbarity. And that's why it will fail, because it's a barbarous thing to do. How to pick allies that have economic interests that coincide with the world we're referring to. There are those people that can become our allies. This is not an economic fight against science. This is short-sightedness of some economic interests against a very broad portion of society, including the business society, that could be perfectly our allies in this combat for truth, enthusiasm for science. And, well, it's already been said here, it's also a matter of personal commitment. It will not give us any points, academic points. It will not make us progress in the national researcher system in Mexico. But we wouldn't be true scientists if we don't at least try to wage this fight.
Adding up to this idea, I would like to use one of the questions from the audience that I believe it fits pretty well in this series of ideas. Now, the role played by communicators and disseminators of science when it comes to generalizing this information to the public at large. So, what is your opinion? Because is that something that we have neglected? Do we leave it for journals? Yes, every time less. But yes, that's true. But how can we make it a true communication policy by scientists?
Well, scientists have to take this upon themselves. Not everyone can do it. I would really find it an aberration for some scientists to become translators to enthuse people about this. This could be, the result could be exactly the opposite, but there are others who can do it. And I think we should each one analyze ourselves and say, this is something that I can do. I will make the effort to translate this information that I have translated. What does it mean? Taking it to a level that's comprehensible, credible, to be assimilated by people. That's the type of translation we're talking about. It's no simple task sometimes, but we're gaining experience on this. I believe these things are very important. Scientific communication is important. It has always been important, but it's also starting to have limitations now because of all the new technologies at our hand and that we have on hand, and also because of a different conception of things. Let me refer to something we're doing in Conavio. Instead of taking science to people, we have to take people to science. That is, invite people to generate information that they already have with scientific value. It's citizen science. That's the purpose of this program. Convincing people that certain training, that with certain capacity or skills and existing technology, they can do the work that a naturalist used to do, as Humboldt, for instance, or Darwin, etc., without necessarily having the same brain behind all this. But the work can be done, very concrete work, and thus contribute with information that can later be accumulating in this sense. This is what we're doing. It just in the work we're doing, we've generated in the last 10 years, not even putting all the ornithologists in Mexico, will they be able, 3 million of additional observations. This is 99% of this type of research. We never would have been able to do this. There's no way. There are people who do it because they like it. They're convinced. They generate a culture to valuation of nature, and then the other naturalist project with 3 new species given to science made by absolute amateurs. They have a camera, one of those smartphones that know a group, and they're really caring for, and they're after it all the time, and they're uploading bunches of photographs, the distribution spheres and everything. So that's perhaps the least important thing. Perhaps the most important thing is that people are starting to absorb the process of generating knowledge, which is the basic part of science. And I think this is one of the things that we should exploit even more. Perhaps this cannot be done everywhere, but it can be done in most of the fields. I mean, for medicine, for instance, the field of medicine, this knowledge could be very useful for everyone.
Yes, in that same sense. We need to reach out to the youth, but not only to scientific discourse on nature, but also nature in itself. That is to say, we've seen that fading out because this techie children, now they see the world through their smartphone and they live in a bubble that they are being led to isolation. How can you take them from their bubble to see an anthill a nest, a real plant. So this has faded away with time. And this is linked to another possibility to be more enthusiastic. It's not only about using language to make people feel enthusiastic, as Sarukan said it. I might be skilled, but if I take that children, that youth, not only to get close to science in the abstract, but to work together with science, there are many possibilities that they feel excited. So I'm convinced that in terms of the European Union, one of the most important levers in Europe, with all of its bureaucratic obstacles, it's Erasmus. Take someone to a different place, so nationalism is cured by traveling. And that being insensible to nature, well, you can cure that from taking people to nature. Take them by the hand and help them be enthusiastic about nature by being in nature.
Yo quisiera
I wanted to emphasize something that I think it's lacking here. That is, there are alternatives, yes. There is a route, a path that not only science is giving us through its information, but this is also being implemented in many sites, in many places, by many social groups, communities, NGOs, and different institutions, even programs. Yes, there are options. And I think this is a part that has to accompany the discourse we've been referring to right now, in which there has to be awareness of the speed at which humankind is degrading Earth from the harmful intervention and functioning of nature. But our conscience on this alternatives is also to be very clear, and this implies having access to information, having the possibility, therefore, of using this information to choose different options. I think part of the key of all this is for people to be able to choose better forms of life, of conduct. But that better way is not only for the individual needs, and this is a process through which we can guarantee that we are contributing towards building a more fair, just, inclusive world, combating poverty, reducing inequalities, and respect for the functioning of ecosystems, which are the basis for this development. Many of the examples we've been able to show that do have alternatives that are viable are quite marginalized. They're like pilot experiences only, and they should really take this very big leap to the necessity of the decision-making process for them to become public policies, to be part of the National Development Plan. And that's exactly where we have to do these constructions that we still need. An informed society will be a society demanding, saying that if these great principles are not complied with, respect for human rights, among them the respect for a healthy environment, but also respect for the rest of the living creatures and beings. If we're not capable as a society to place this right at the core of the debate, of this discussion, then the decision maker will never make decisions and nothing will ever happen. So we have a punishment. We have to have punishment for that. I see every 3 years, every 2 years, campaigns that are absolutely void, shallow in terms of environmental platforms and the ethical processes, those ethical values. And I think that this is the responsibility of academicians, of NGOs, of the media, of communicators of science, etc., for us to be able to place in this debate in the following months seriously all these issues and raise, of course, the level of the debate and make it mandatory for those that are responsible, the future administration in Mexico, so that these issues are a central part of the national agenda. Yes, this is like always desired, wanted, a dream, but it's still very difficult for us to translate all this, not only to place it in political issues and the different spaces of, and also the way we do our government, how to go about doing government. And many people are putting all these topics in their own proposals and discourses. However, when it's a matter of ruling, of governing, that's where we are always running short on this. They always end up owing us something. And we're saying, well, we don't have Trump in Mexico. And it seems that the anti-scientific discourse is not that it is explicit in Mexico, but to a certain degree, it is not in the way we do our government activities. So this is a challenge we have from the academic spaces, the university level, not only placing on the table our proposals, opinions, and decisions, but also, in effect, for those to be translated in a way we do government and government activities and the conduction of those governments. Yes.
You wanted to say something? Yes. What I wanted to share is that, well, being a scientist, in terms of our government responsibilities at any level, means to make decisions about the reality that I have in front of me. That is what we really need to do. I know that finally there are many political pressures, and I know that this pressure is so much that in spite of the evidence, in spite of all data, in spite of every single fact, you have to make the decision that it's actually not the best one. Why? Because we live in a society where there are many things that must be considered, but from there, that this is the exception to making it the rule, that's really far away, and the standard should be that, a guideline to make decisions for the benefit of our society and based on the best possible knowledge that can make you make the best decisions for the benefit of everyone, not only for the benefit of just a few. And we have understood it the other way because a few are benefiting from that capacity, from having that influence that distorts decisions to some extent. So that is the change, because most of these people, I know that they believe in science. So what we should do is that there is a way to regulate knowledge, factual knowledge of what's happening in order to make decisions. And there are mechanisms, as Julia said, to punish if things are not that way. And again, the best way to oversee all this and to punish actions like this is with a well-informed society, educated in this area with the best knowledge possible, and very active demanding that this happens. So this is not going to happen. So, and that's why we need to communicate knowledge the best way possible to public at large in this area and many other areas that affect the lives of the citizens of this country. Julia, please, if you would like to close.
When we talk about all these topics, my students are always claiming that my generation and the parents' generation and the generation of my parents, the great-grandparents have left a very deteriorated world, and now they're having to pay for the invoice, and they have to solve these problems. And there's, of course, a claim, a very strong claim being made. I think we continue doing everything possible, and still, there are still many things to do in this generation of those of us here in this panel, but I do bet that change will come from youth. They have the energy, the stamina. They showed on September 19th, and those springs of human solidarity are well lubricated. So this energy placed on the construction of a better world at least will allow them to leave their children a better world than the ones we're living them. This is not lack of scientific knowledge. It's not even a lack of economic resources. I believe there's a lack of organization of society at large that is not claiming, demanding the government to fulfill their responsibilities as public servants. I hope that as a society we're capable of implementing this change, because young people are making it an obligation for it, and this is the invoice they're having to pay for us.
Well, I think that such actions that we're trying to opt for in order to transform this unsustainable situation, well, is connected by making this not a sacrifice. We have to sacrifice our plan of life, our habits, everything, just to save the planet. Well, so it turns the issue into a very negative thing, because the planet will save for itself as soon as humans are out of this country. But the issue is not to see this as a risk, not see it as a sacrifice, not seeing it as detrimental, but instead an opportunity to have a better life, to have a better life, not only us, not only a few of us. How can we make the best out of this situation? And I believe that this is the challenge that we have ahead of us. In that sense, that is why I'm inviting people to be enthusiastic, to think of a better world, not only a world that follows the restrictions of nature. I mean, to live according to natural restrictions can be very fun, very healthy, and very good. If I consider the law of gravity, I don't want to fall down if I reach that edge. There's no joy in it. It can't be joyful to waste. It can't be a joy to get into your kitchen and throw oil in your walls and then try to clean it. That should not give you any pleasure. I mean, to live according to natural limits. And that is one of the ways of living fully, and that's the point.
Very well. I truly thank you, Dr. Tudela, Dr. Sarukan, Dr. Carabias. I just wanted to close with this reflection that we were making this morning with a group of collaborators, thinking and rethinking, acting and amending and reacting, acting once more, means that science is not perfect, but no human activity is. Although it's the best thing we have to understand, contend, and improve our steps on this planet Earth, in this world. I want to thank everyone for your presence, the audience for being here with us. Thank you so much, everyone. And the organizers of this event, thank you very much. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti, al contrario.
Doctor, muchísimas
Muchas
gracias.
gracias.